isn't just business news, we're news for business people.
Hello, I'm delighted to be having this conversation with India's Chief Economic Advisor, Arvind Subramanian. Arvind, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
What I thought we'll do is we'll take a step back from some of the high-frequency economic indicators and talk a little bit about what I call the changes and the challenges in the Indian economy over the years. But given that we had the GDP release yesterday, it would be conspicuous if we don't talk about that. So let me begin with yesterday's GDP release. Manufacturing at 7% must have been heartening. Do you believe, or are you reassured that we've somewhat gone past the demonetization blues?
See, I think that first of all, I mean, on the face of it, what is encouraging about this is that there were 5 quarters of deceleration.
Correct.
Remember, especially at a time when the world was accelerating, especially last 2 to 3 quarters. So that was the kind of the worrying part. So this seems to have arrested that deceleration. But as they say, one swallow does not a summer make. I think we have to be very watchful going forward. We have to see what the manufacturing numbers, are indicating, because actually what the numbers mean is that formal manufacturing is apparently growing at 9%. So we have to see, whether this will persist, whether it reflects, the fact that we've gone past, the twin policy experiments or not. I think we have to be watchful, cautiously kind of be hopeful that these trends will continue going forward, because I think the important thing is that, are we doing enough to, address our real challenges, which is, the twin balance sheet challenge, sure, the lack of demand and all of that. And I think also on the external front, there's good news and bad news. Remember that the good news is that the world economy is picking up.
Yeah.
So I think there's been some improvement in export growth, which I think will help going forward. Yeah. But oil prices are also going up. So I think on the whole, I think on the face of it, it seems encouraging, but one swallow does not a summer make.
And I called it the trend is right, the levels are perhaps not there yet. But, I actually do want to pick up on exports, since you mentioned that, and that's been a puzzle. There is certainly one school of economic thought in India, which is export growth has been so anemic, especially the last 2 quarters of global growth has been very, very robust. And in this context, the argument, or this school of thought argues that small and medium enterprises account for half of India's exports. There are perhaps supply chains are broken, and we may have a deeper supply side issue here than we recognize. Do you subscribe to that?
See, I think there's been some confusion over the export numbers. Yeah, I've been looking at them a little bit carefully, and if you look at manufacturing export growth in the last 3 months, it's been at about 9% in value, dollar value terms. When you do the smoothing and everything.
Manufacturing
exports. Okay. It's a bit down from the early part of the year, but 9% growth is still substantially greater than what we were doing for much of 15 and 16. Now, so in that sense, I think it's picked up. I think the question, what is not clear to me, and we're looking at the numbers, is have our exports grown commensurate with the pickup, as you said, in world trade volumes and the pickup in growth in many of the other countries as well? It's not clear to me. We're looking at the analysis, but it's not that exports haven't picked up from the trough of the 15 and 16. 15 and 16 exports were really, I think, export growth was very weak, and now they have picked up. Part of it, of course, is world demand, but your question about have supply chains broken? I think the jury is going to be out, because unless we get a good sense of how the rest of the world is doing. Also, we're doing some analysis for the survey to see, in fact, whether exports have been affected by the twin experiments that we had or not. Both demonetization and GST. So we're going to look into that a bit more carefully. And so until we finish that, I still would like to reserve judgment on that.
Then what about imports? I mean, imports been very strong.
See, I think the supply chain broken story is for both exports and imports.
Correct. That's why I asked the
exactly.
question,
So it was true that import growth was very rapid. Yeah. But in the latest
Especially
few months,
non-oil, non-gold.
Yeah, exactly. I'm talking only non-oil, non-gold. Exactly. So the argument was that there's been a negative supply shock, which has affected both manufacturing exports and domestic production competing with manufacturing imports as well. Again, we're looking at these things exactly as we speak, and reserve judgment. But on the import numbers too, the latest numbers show a marked deceleration relative to earlier.
Right.
So let's see what is due to what.
Okay. And I know you've been on record saying our potential is 8 to 8.5. We should not be satisfied with anything less. But you've also cautioned about real incomes in the agriculture sector. And agriculture GVA was again anemic as yesterday's numbers.
Yeah.
And I know I heard you yesterday about terms of trade there. But what is your prognosis for real incomes in agriculture?
See, I think that in the economic survey that we put out in July, we saw very clearly that for the cereals, real incomes had been relatively constant, because I think for the MSP, I think support this, puts a floor on prices. But for the other crops, all the other crops like cereals, pulses, the oil seeds, and the vegetables, some of them, or many of the vegetables, we saw that prices had declined quite substantially. Now, to me, the puzzle there was that normally when you have a positive supply shock, prices do come down, but they don't come down so much as to reduce incomes. Okay, so that's what had happened when we looked at the data in July. Now, since then, there's been another twist, that for the non-perishables, oil seeds and pulses, prices had been low, remained low. But for the perishables like onions and tomatoes, the prices have spiked enormously.
Right.
And unseasonally as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Normally in the winter they actually come down. So my sense is that agricultural incomes are under stress.
Okay.
Yeah. And that is why the government, about a couple of weeks ago, we imposed some tariffs on oil seeds and pulses to shore up farm prices and therefore farm incomes. So this year, so the question is that why has it been that this year, normally positive supply shocks are associated with positive income shocks. Yeah?
Correct,
but this year that's been different. Why that is the case, I think needs much more investigation.
Okay, but you're not specifically worried about private consumption in the backdrop of stagnant real incomes in the agriculture sector?
See, I think at some point, I think it is going to be, was going to be an issue, but remember that part of that is going to be offset by the loan waivers. So, right? See, about 18 months ago, we were quite worried that even if agricultural incomes went up, the indebtedness you would deleverage, so to speak, and therefore consumption wouldn't pick up. But to some extent, that's been addressed by the loan waivers. But that being said, now we're talking not even from income to consumption, but income itself has not been as robust as it should be. So I think therefore, so what we should do long run to boost agricultural productivity, I think is a kind of a central issue policy going forward.
Okay. So now I want to kind of move beyond some of the high frequency indicators, like I said, and talk a little bit big picture. So the one kind of description about the quality of GDP growth or economic growth over the last year or two has been that of jobless growth. Jobs are certainly mainstream. Certainly thanks to some of the political leadership of the country, it's now mainstream, it's being discussed everywhere. Again, there are two schools of thought. One that says, listen, we do not have evidence that it is either job-full or jobless, and the other school of thought which says it's clearly jobless. Which school do you belong to?
Yeah, I honestly belong to the former school because I haven't actually, I've looked at all the data, and there are so many problems with all the data sources. Some are very old. The most comprehensive one is very old. The more high frequency ones have all these other issues with them, and I can honestly say that that's why in the first survey that we did 3 years ago, we somewhat foolishly took on the employment question and then discovered that maybe the numbers were not as robust as it should be. So I think that's why Niti Aayog was entrusted with coming, and they're going to come out with that. And I honestly don't have enough of a basis to know, one way or the other. But however, I think that, but we can still talk about the policy question. Even if we are agnostic or ambivalent about it.
Absolutely. And in fact, I was going to actually pick up on work that you did in the last year's survey, where you talked about employment elasticity, and you picked up two sectors, right? The apparel exports and leather exports. And I'm just kind of extrapolating from your numbers. You said every 10 lakhs in investment in these sectors, the apparel sector creates 240 jobs. The leather sector creates 70 jobs, whereas the classic Make in India type sectors that we think of, auto manufacturing and steel, produce anywhere between 1 and 3 jobs. Now, with this employment, with this kind of diversity in employment elasticity, and the fact that our exports are not picking up, it's reasonable to impute that there is perhaps a jobless growth, isn't it?
See, I think that the one observation I would make is the following, that if you go back to the kind of boom period, right, 3 sectors that did very well were IT, agriculture, and construction. Okay. But and of course, exports also did very well. But to me, I think, and I'm going to answer the question in the following way, is to say that, you see, I don't think there is in India a serious employment strategy which is not part of a broader growth strategy. I mean, I just don't think you can say, I will create jobs without, increasing the size of the pie. It just doesn't work in India, right? Therefore, I think there are always going to be 2 components of the growth strategy, which is to revive growth to the 8 to 10%, whatever, and then supplement it with, kind of sector-specific policies, maybe picking on sectors that have greater potential for job growth. And that's why, we picked, clothing and leather and footwear. And also remember that in June of 2016, kind of recognizing the opportunity for these sectors, we enacted a clothing package. And also recognizing that these were sectors where an opportunity was being created because China was vacating space, because as Chinese wages and incomes rise, it's clear that they're vacating space.
And Bangladesh and Vietnam are capturing those.
Bangladesh, Vietnam, Laos, Ethiopia, etc. But the point is that it's an opportunity that we should also, make a really aggressive, bid for. And that's what I think government wants to do.
In fact, that was going to be my question, Arvind. I mean, so with, when we see numbers like these, the immediate policy temptation is to pick sectors. Isn't there since we're talking big picture, isn't there a larger worry about the state, and certainly the Indian state, picking sectors for policy measures? And I know it's always come back to hurt us over a longer period of time. Do you still believe that we should pick sectors, sector-focused policy?
See, Danny Roderick is one of my co-authors.
And one of my favorite economists,
And, he's a big believer in industrial policy. See, I'm a little bit more, I'm agnostic. It's not that I want, I have a strong view. Let me tell you why I'm agnostic on this, right? On the one hand, it seems to me that, in some of these sectors, we should be doing well, and traditionally we didn't. We haven't been traditionally, but it still seems to me that we can, especially given the potential, like clothing and footwear and so on. After all, despite all the challenges of our economy, wage rates are still very competitive in India. In certain places we still have reasonable access to world markets. And there are firms in this sector that are doing very well. So it's not that we have no successes in these sectors. The challenge is to find why some firms are successful, or number of firms, and how we can kind of scale that up to other firms. So in that sense, it's not picking a model that has been an unambiguous disaster or failure, but so there's something there that can be picked. Right? But on the other hand, I do think that why I'm a little bit more reticent, and probably echoing some your thoughts, is that one, I think where perhaps I kind of don't agree with Danny as much is that, industrial policy, the state capacity requirements for industrial policy are quite, big in two senses. Having the ability to, pick. But I think much more important, which is where I think we've failed completely, is to facilitate exit where it fails. Remember that many of these things are going to fail, and that's part of industrial strategy. I mean, if there are no failures, you've not done a good industrial strategy, right? Industrial policy. But you have to fail. But remember, and this comes back to one of the big themes of, certainly one of the big themes, one of my big lessons in India over the last 2 years, and I say this in a slightly glib way, which I kind of like the saying, so I'm going to say it. I think that over the last 40 years, we've gone from kind of capitalism without exit, from socialism without entry to capitalism without exit. So if exit is going to be so difficult in India, then I think the onus on industrial policy is that much greater, because it's not just picking the right winners, but allowing the losers to fail, where our record has not been very good. So that's what makes me a little bit more ambivalent about industrial policy in India.
And by exit, you don't merely mean bankruptcy filings, do you? And do you believe the current bankruptcy code addresses some part of that problem?
So two things that I think that when I mean exit, I mean much more than bankruptcy.
Right, I figured.
For example,
labor.
There are lots of labor, and there are labor, and just there are so many public sector firms which are very inefficient and things. But this leads me to bankruptcy, because I think that in some ways, one of, I think, the biggest reforms in the last 2 years, right? GST is one of them. We'll come to that in a second.
Yes.
I think that the bankruptcy law and the NCLT process are possibly going to be one of the big reforms. And of course, we'll have to wait to see how it works out, etc. But I think the reason why I'm saying what I'm saying is that for the first time, it seems to me that we may have come upon or hit upon a framework, administrative legal framework that will allow exit to happen, right? In terms of the creditor-debtor relationship, but more broadly exit, right? And if that happens, I think it would actually be unprecedented in India, where we've not had this kind of bankruptcy and exit before. So that's why I'm very kind of quite excited, but also watching with great attention. I mean, we have to see how it works out.
And we're having teething problems.
That's clearly. I mean, that's going to be the case. But if we can get some successes in the NCLT process, then it would be quite interesting and unique in India, because we've had BIFR. Air India, the public sector banks, the fertilizer firms, all of these things, lots of agricultural policies from which we've not been able to exit. But here, for the first time, it's possible. And if you can get some early successes, prominent successes, I think then that would be, I think, quite a landmark achievement if this were to happen.
Sure. Yeah, and so that brings me to another kind of big narrative around formalization. I mean, I think we've started hearing this term about formalization of India's economy, and when we talk about, say, apparel exports or leather exports, a large part of these two sectors, or not just these, a large part of India's sectors are what we call informal in the Indian context.
Correct.
And there's this big narrative about formalization. I mean, let's first define formalization. What, in your view, is formalization? Bringing them into the tax bracket? Is that what it is?
See, I think it's formalization a little bit in the eyes of the definer and the beholder, right? I think there could be at least, 2 or 3 versions of this, right? One, you bring them into the tax net, okay? Second, that's on the point of view of the firms.
Yeah.
Next, from the point of view of the employees, you bring them formal as in they get some of the social security protections that they would otherwise not have. A third definition could be that firms, individuals rely less on cash and more on, non-cash digital forms of payment.
Sure.
Yeah. So all of these, I think, come under the rubric of what one might call formalization.
Okay. Then, in that context, there's again a big school of thought that says a lot of these informal firms exist and are viable only when they are informal. If we have to either coerce them to be more formal, or we undergo a process of formalization, do you believe this can actually be a smooth transition, given the size and the importance of this sector for India?
Yeah, I think that, I think it's a very good question. I think that we have to, recognize that formalization will have clearly long-term benefits, but there will be transitional costs from formalization. I think we have to accept that. And I think the focus of policy should be how do we, help those who are going to be, part of these transitional costs of formalization. Take the GST, for example, right?
And I'm going to come to that. Yeah.
Just take the GST as an example. I think that in the case of the GST, perhaps the brunt of this kind of this exact phenomenon that you're describing arises for those firms. Look, there are firms that what we call sell finally to the consumer, right? Which, and I think we've made it quite easy for them. The B2C firms, we made this very. But I think the biggest kind of challenges are faced by those small firms.
Right.
Who sell to bigger firms, right?
Absolutely.
And the bigger firms will not countenance because if then you just have to, you just have to kind of go out of business. So I think that's where the challenge is.
Yeah. Clearly.
And I think what government policy is going to be going forward for them. One is that we have to make sure that the compliance burdens for them are really very minimal, and that's why a committee has been set up in Guwahati to make sure that happens. I think the second thing we have to do for them is to make available credit, much more easily for them. Because remember, for many of these small firms, you kind of little bit take a hit on the fact that you have to go from informal to formal.
Yeah.
But I think it can be offset by, because remember, the process of formalization could in principle and should make access to credit much cheaper and easier than before. For example, if you have a tax trail of payments, then you can use that, even as I say, a bill to get discounted at the banks, for example.
Sure.
Right? So I think that's the way we have to think creatively about how to address, the challenges faced by some of the small and medium enterprises. But some transitional costs, I think, are going to be, we've been seeing that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of access to credit, I mean, it's unclear to me what comes first. I mean, do you have to be formal first to get access to credit, or do you get access to credit and then become formal? And I think there's a tension between the two.
Yeah, I think that, so in some ways now, given that we've kind of crossed the Rubicon on this, then I think the kind of tax, being part of the tax net, has been kind of, either induced or whatever forced upon thing. I think that we should use that opportunity to immediately, make credit available to them. So in a sense, the question has been answered to some extent.
True. Yeah. But you do believe it's a necessary condition for growth for India in the decades to come? Formalization, larger share of formal economy.
I think that, the answer has to be unambiguously yes, because that's the history of development. The history of development is more and more informal becoming formal. I've not studied, enough cases, or enough episodes when it happened. I think, maybe we need to focus on that. But we know that, this has been the process. I mean, part of the process of development has been formalization.
Sure. But those happen naturally. I mean, I'm not sure if there was policy impetus that focused and laid emphasis on formalization.
Yeah, I think maybe there's a kind of policy acceleration here that's coming about. So there's going to be an endogenous process. There's going to be some induced process. I think that, but that there has to be some, and that's good in the long run.
Sure.
I have no doubts about that.
Okay. So I'll come to GST, and I want to talk about GST in the larger kind of context of federalism.
Exactly.
But GST will perhaps be your single lasting legacy of your tenure here. Right from the revenue neutral rate, the revenue neutral committee. But I don't want to get into the transitional issues around GST. Those are transitional. Really, now states are guaranteed revenues for 5 years. Then we've got the fisc. For the 5-year period, are we betting too much on buoyancy? Given rationalization of rates are happening. So there's neutrality is somewhat now, that anchor has been dropped.
See, I actually think that sooner rather than later, and well within the 5 years, I think the 14% compensation will become moot, because states are going to be generating, from this. And I'm not saying this just based on, we're beginning to look at the numbers. I think that a combination of a much bigger base and a better compliance will, and this is a kind of wager that I will happily take with you.
Yeah, in fact,
that, as I said, sooner rather than later, well within the 5 years, the 14% is going to become moot.
So not year one, but clearly, some between year 2 and 3. Essentially, you're saying we're going to be exceeding targets. I mean, our revenue expectations.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, beyond revenue neutral after a period of time. Yeah, I am saying that.
Well within the 5 years. Well
within the 5 years.
Okay, I think I'm prepared to accept that, actually, Rachel. But that's actually because there are questions around fisc, especially with oil going up and GST and all of those things.
That's again short term, and
I agree.
Yeah, we're talking more about the 2 to 5 year horizon.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now I want to come to the other issue that you and I have been talking about, which is divergence and convergence. And
but Praveen, just one, since you began this with the cooperative federalism aspect of it, I think it is worth emphasizing, and I think in some ways I would argue that the dimension of GST reform that is arguably as big as the tax reform part is just as maybe in the bankruptcy, perhaps we've kind of come upon a structure that, possibly could work on exit and bankruptcy. I think that in the GST process and the council, we have maybe created perhaps the first credible, effective institution of cooperative federalism in India. And I think that's worth thinking about because...
Absolutely. In fact, I have written saying I kind of compare it to the Constituent Assembly.
I don't know enough to whether I would go that far, but I do, see, because look at it slightly, because you wanted to think big picture, right? See, look at this moment on this cooperative federalism and this moment internationally, right? I think if you look at Brexit and US, it's the opposite phenomenon of turning inward.
Correct.
Whereas this has been a kind of let's pool sovereignty and stuff. And what's remarkable has been that every decision has been taken by consensus within the GST Council. And see, the thing is that I'm a big believer, as you know, and this is probably the book that I want to write when I leave, is that I think there are the early stages of the creation of states or institutions are very important for creating a kind of the values and norms, etc. Right? I think the empowered committee that preceded the GST Council had some of that same kind of cooperative federalism thing, and I think that's kind of carried over into the GST Council. So I think as an experiment in cooperative federalism, I'm very excited by this. And also I think this is, and maybe we'll come to that later, this is the model, I think, for other sectors and other areas of policy reform as well.
I was going to come to that. Okay. But precisely, I wanted to bring in divergence in the context of GST and cooperative federalism. Because my view on that is, first, I think we both agree that India is diverging and it's an outlier and it's puzzling. And I call it the 3-3-3 phenomenon, where the 3 richest states are 3 times richer than the 3 poorer states among the large states, and this is the highest in independent India's history. So we've got economic divergence. To top that, India is perhaps the only large federal nation that has political divergence, political diversity. We've got large states that are largely governed by regional political parties that perhaps don't have as much of an incentive to be in that council, GST council, and agree to various things that perhaps is in the interest of the larger good. So when you have very rich states, very poor states with political divergence sitting across a table and trying to decide tax rates for everything from smartphones to food items, are you still optimistic that this would work?
See, the first point is that while we agree on this divergence, what a spatial regional divergence, I think we should just, so that we don't succumb, in a sense, offset the default Piketty temptation, which we have to stress, is that absolute levels are still rising. Just to make that clear. So absolute levels are rising, but there's
some are growing faster. The richer ones are growing faster.
So it's relative income diversion. Just to make that clear. But I think you raise a very good question. And firstly, I don't know that whether other countries, the political divergence among states, maybe that's a very insightful observation. But yes, because there is political diversity, and it's something that the finance minister has also said, that when you have more regional parties, then you have more regional concerns, and therefore cooperative federalism is kind of a little bit more difficult to work with. I think that the counter to that perhaps is that we still have a few national parties, which I think, but it's not bad. Two.
Some would say just one.
But let's see. But I think so. I would worry when we had no national parties, and then but we still have 2, and I think that remember that this kind of exercise is going to coexist also with competitive federalism. So we're going to see that some of that political divergence manifesting itself in competitive federalism, but I think there's enough good sense to prevail to also have cooperative federalism. Now let me make the link between the two in the context of the GST itself, right? That if you think about it, what is nice about this competitive federalism is it actually checks undesirable, this cooperative federalism, the GSC, checks undesirable competitive federalism, because you don't want states to be competing based on tax rates and things and exemptions and race to the bottom. So in a sense, you want to force competitive federalism into areas where you should be competing, like offering better conditions, more accessible and stable power, and all of these things. So I think that balance between competitive cooperative is very good. But your question is still open. I would just say that so far we've made it work in this sector. Let's see how kind of things pans out. But it's true that if we kind of if power really disperses like that, and you only have or have a predominant of regional parties, then how do you kind of keep cooperative? That's an open question. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah, and I think that is something that I've always felt has not been kind of taken into account adequately when we talk about federalism from a policy perspective, the political diversity of India, especially among the large states. I mean, 4 states account for half of all sales taxes in this country. I mean, the interstate trade. And out of these 4 states, almost all of them are governed by regional parties. In some governed or regional parties are very dominant. So that was my larger point about.
See, but remember in this instance, remember that it's a very good point you've made. But I think a small insight on this is that the reason it has worked or working in this case also is that the powerful large states, as it were, are the poorer states and the consuming states. So GST is actually, in a sense, when you go from, you think, although this is not going to work out in practice, but in principle, GST was moving from a production base to a consumption base, and therefore the poorer states are also the consuming states. So in that sense, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, etc., have stood to gain from this process, and so it's been, you've been able to, bring them into the process.
Yeah, but you've got states like Tamil Nadu, where the 2 national parties are not present at all, but is a significant contributor to India's economic growth as well as to tax revenues. So,
but there I think that, it's a fair point, but I think that's where, ultimately the buoyancy and the compliance will mean it can be win-win for everyone, even for those. And actually, we're beginning to see that in the data. You will see, for example, one thing you will see, going back to a kind of minor second wager that we can have, is that those states that feared the most that they would lose, the net exporting states, those are the people who will be out of the compensation net the quickest, I think.
Because of service taxes?
Service tax, and also consumer, the Maharashtras, the Gujarats, Tamil Nadus, I think they will not do badly.
No, I think I'm prepared to agree with you on that one. But I then, in this context, I want to talk about GST's impact on divergence going forward. And I think this is where we perhaps diverge in our views. My kind of view is GST does remove an important fiscal tool that the states were using. You could argue that was the wrong policy, but taxation was an important tool that states over the years across the world have used to attract business. Now, if Walmart wants to come in and set up a factory in India, Bihar today cannot say, I can give you these tax benefits, so come to Bihar, even though Bihar would perhaps need Walmart much more than, say, a Tamil Nadu or a Karnataka or a Maharashtra. So GST does remove that fiscal tool. Now, in this context, how is a Bihar going to compete? It's all right to say power and governance, but they don't have the state capacity yet.
See, but then I would say, firstly, 2 or 3 responses again to a very good question. One is just that, again, I know this is not directly addressing your point, but I think it should be clarified in this context. Is remember that states still retain the power to tax on alcohol and petroleum and electricity and others, right? So in some ways, I think still 40 to 50% of revenues do comes to that. So that just is a factual point. But my second point is the following: that it's more kind of an empirical observation that if you have weak state capacity and you're not able to provide power, etc., you're also probably not going to be able to attract investment just based on giving tax concessions. I mean, it's an empirical, it's not a watertight theoretical argument, but I think after all, Bihar over the last 35, 40 years has not attracted, even though it had the ability to use exemption.
No, but the cases of South Carolina attracting BMW entirely through fiscal incentives.
But that's because the basic governance and state capacity
So
stuff.
there's a basic minimum.
Yeah, there's a basic minimum you read, which I think, and that's why, Gujarat was the one that was able to attract, or Tamil Nadu were able to attract.
Right.
They could do. So in that sense, I think that it's kind of a, if you have the state capacity, you probably don't need the exemptions. If you don't have it, it wouldn't work even with the exemptions.
Okay.
So I think that's my kind of working proposition here. And so in that sense, I think GST has not undermined that at all.
So it would not exacerbate divergence any more than we were already diverging.
Yeah.
But then how do you argue that it will actually help in convergence?
Yeah, so the way it would help convergence, I think, is that basically, now remember, you've gone to a consumption tax, so you've got rid of all these distortions,
sure,
right?
Sure.
Now, it's true that on the one hand, I think that the impact of this on what's going to happen to trade between states is a little bit open, and we've kind of agreed on that. So I think the way it can help convergence is, in a sense, by putting pressure on these other governments, to recognize that you can't play this incentive game, and you have to play the other game. So that's the way I think it's going to work, and I think to the extent that it increases interstate trade, I think the forces of convergence also could increase, but that is ambiguous. I don't know, because see, in the economic survey that we did last year, we did raise the possibility that India's trade was so high, at least relative to what we felt, partly because of the distortions that we had in terms of the interstate taxes and so on.
Correct.
So let's wait and see whether this is actually going to increase interstate trade or not, which I think it will, because we are creating one common market. And then if we do that, I think then the forces of convergence, because remember that the puzzle about convergence in India is aggravated, the puzzle about lack of convergence in India is aggravated by two related observations. One, trade between states is quite high.
Fairly robust,
fairly robust. And migration is also pretty big. So why is that happening?
Are you convinced of the migration? I know you use railway data. Given there are natural barriers to migration in terms of cultural diversity that a country like India has, which is perhaps not there in countries like America, are you convinced that we have free movement of labor across?
See, I think that remember that the contrast I've always conceptually made is between India and China, right?
Yeah.
But some things you're saying, actually, see, in China you've had labor mobility as the force for convergence.
Correct.
For two reasons, right? One is it's relatively uniform, right?
Exactly.
They're all, and the point that you're making, Han Chinese everywhere, 90%.
Yeah.
Second, of course, I think that you remember mobility involves overcoming fixed costs. So in order to do that, I think the differential in earnings between where you are, things has to be pretty big.
Yeah.
So rapid growth in China, the high growth, actually, both whatever overcame whatever thing and made people. In India, it's true that the fixed costs are higher for the reasons that you're saying.
Correct.
But I think that we've had growth enough to overcome some of these costs, because finally I'm just basing my arguments on the numbers that were very surprising.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
It is true. I mean, if you look at what we've done may not have been perfect. I think there's ways to improve upon that. But if you just look at the raw numbers, it's just astoundingly high.
Right.
And much higher than what we believed. So I think we need to maybe kind of little bit reverse our defaults and not think that we not have enough mobility, but to think that why we do have so much mobility and see,
Sure.
So I think the numbers do speak to having to change our priors on how mobile
labor is.
How mobile labor is in India.
Okay. Which also tells me that perhaps the wage differentials have grown so large that it's overcome that.
I think that could be.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that I wanted to, which not many people have heard of, which is in the context of GST, is you're now talking about the electricity market and a similar concept. So why don't you kind of talk about what do you have in mind for the power market in terms of one nation, one power, if I can call it that?
Yeah. See, let me say, I think there's a lot to say about power, but I just want to say two things about power which are related to GST. You know, I don't want to talk about the power sector because there's so many issues there.
Just related to this.
To me, it is a travesty, absolute travesty, that 70 years after independence, we don't have one market for power in India, right? States can impose tariffs, as in not electricity tariffs, but as in tariffs, protectionist measures, which prevent someone from one state buying power from another state. It's just straightforward protectionism. Balkanized power markets, a balkanized economic India. I think it's a travesty that 70 years after independence we should allow this, we should permit this.
Is India an outlier in that? I mean, compared to other large federal economies?
I see. I'm not sure, but I would doubt very much. I would doubt in the European Union you're allowed to, because the four freedoms include services and thing as well. So I would doubt that. And in any case, I think that we should not. There's a principle here. One economic market. I think we should have that. But the other thing is that these, the impediments to this, i.e. the tariffs that we imposed, actually sustain indefensible policies in the states. Because remember, you don't want to allow, firms to buy, you have a free market in power, because that's the way you protect your base in a country, and you sustain this subsidization and cross-subsidization that happens. Yeah. So I think that's one observation. The second observation is that it seems to me that, we can talk a lot about what needs to be done, but there is a question of, how do you make it happen? It's very easy to say, reform, tell the state governments to reform. Yeah. They haven't done that for a long time, right? But is there a role for the center in actually, using sticks and carrots and the framework of cooperative federalism to bring this about? And those are the two GST parallels that I see with power.
Sure. Now I want to move on to taxation and taxation structure in our in the country. The general argument now, there's certainly been a loud rhetoric around black money, and kind of the argument goes like this: 3% of Indians pay taxes. So economic survey said 7 voters out of 100 pay taxes, whereas the US has 70, and hence there are a lot of people dodging taxes, and hence we have a large black economy. Now I want to put that in context where our per capita income is about 1 lakh rupees. Our income tax exemption threshold is 2.5 lakhs. 2.5 times of per capita income. The OECD average is 0.5. We are 5 times the world average in terms of income tax exemption threshold. Given inequality, and any statistical distribution will immediately tell us there are not a lot of people who are going to be earning 2.5 times the average income. So, I mean, are we perhaps misplaced in this whole narrative about, sure, I don't mean to say there are no tax dodgers. Sure, there are people who are not. But surely 3% can't be 30%. I mean, the difference can't be that 30% of Indians ought to pay taxes and only 3%, given where our numbers are. And to give you some more historical numbers, in the last 20 years, income tax exemption threshold has gone up 6 times. Nominal per capita incomes have gone up 3 times. Exemption thresholds are growing faster than nominal incomes. We are bound to have more and more people not pay.
But here, I thought we were going to begin by being on the opposite side, but suddenly I realized you were exactly on the same side.
Okay.
You see, this is, I don't want to sound kind of trumpeting the survey, but in fact, in not the 2017 survey, but the 2016 survey, we had a chart showing exactly that China and India and the exemptions. You see, I think what you've said is a very good point, but here's what I think makes it kind of doubly unfortunate, right? The Chinese strategy was fix a low exemption threshold and then do nothing. And the do nothing actually is what increases the tax net, because nominal incomes grow and people come into the tax net. Yeah. I think we have, erred in that very seriously. And I don't think we're going to err on that again. You see, because the best reform is when you have to do nothing. I think that's kind of the Narasimha Rao probably principle of reform, where the status quo is reform.
Sure.
Seldom do you get that opportunity, and I think we should do that. And I think at least, because it's going to be, actually reducing the threshold is going to be
politically
tough. So
difficult.
I think, so the solution that is to basically say freeze the threshold, we have to do other things as well.
Yeah.
But certainly raising thresholds is, I think, inadvisable.
So the new direct tax committee that has been set up, will you promise to take this up? Should we even link exemption to some sort of per capita income? I mean, there should be some framework by which we do this.
But by looking at your numbers that you cited, I think we are so far away,
absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
That if we can't reduce the threshold,
just
we should
do nothing for at least.
That would, I think, be the way forward.
Hopefully you put this on the agenda in the direct tax committee. But the other thing I wanted to talk to you about taxation is about direct versus indirect. I mean, states and center combined, our direct to indirect ratio is 35-65, the exact opposite of other OECD nations. We all know the indirect taxes are regressive, hurts the poor more than the rich, but there is so much emphasis, and I understand it's easier to collect. I understand administrative efficiency of indirect taxes, but surely that can't be the reason for us to have such a skewed ratio, and I don't see this being debated or something to be done to correct this skew.
See, I think that firstly, I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying, but for a slightly different reason, right? My own view, and based on all the research that I've done on economic development, is that we know that it's taxation that's the glue to institutional development, and direct taxation, where people feel that they're actually contributing.
And it's progressive,
and if you look at the history of Western economic development as well, I think early on in the United States you had actually land taxation financing the infrastructure development. Then you had the income tax, and then of course you had the welfare state based and the wars leading to more of that. You see, I think that, but one lesson I draw from that is that in advanced countries, it's some of these major shocks that have led to huge increases in income and social security taxation as well. We've not suffered this shock, so I think it's that way. It's a little bit more difficult to do, but I firmly believe that you have to build that link between center and state, between the citizen and state via income taxation. So I think we should do more. But let me give you kind of a new dimension on this, which I've been thinking about the last few months and weeks on this. So the question is, how do you do that? It's a political economy question, right? How do you do that? Now, here's for me the thought I want to leave you with, and maybe you've thought about this more than I have, that we are into more and more devolution, right? Of expenditure and also tax powers, right? But I think that in India, the closer you are to the people, the more difficult it is for you to tax them. And that's why you take
an alibi, you mean?
No, it's not alibi. No, it's not alibi. No, I'm not saying it as alibi at all. But think about it this way: property taxes, under as we and we all know, underused. I suspect that the third tier, even the Panchayati Raj institutions, are probably actually raising very little money relative to what they could. So here's the dilemma, right? That we think that income taxation is very important. Then, if you start devolving more powers, and the closer you are, the more difficult it is to raise, then you're in this structural problem. You're devolving expenditure responsibilities, and you're not going to get taxation there.
Right.
So what do you do? And I think that's kind of the bigger long-term thing that we need to think about.
That's a fascinating thought, Arvind. I realize you just flipped the entire idea of taxation without representation in some sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And essentially what I hear you say is maybe it's a good thing that states in India don't have powers for direct taxes. I mean, income taxes, they don't levy income tax.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
But see, but then the problem is that if you give them expenditure responsibilities and they don't tax, then there's a structural mismatch. The accountability will break down.
Absolutely.
Right? So this is the kind of the dilemma for us, right? Because what that suggests is that it's going to be easier to tax the further away you are from the people in the income tax. Therefore, the center is actually going to be able to tax more, relatively speaking, than the more devolved fiscal centers, as it were. So I think it's a kind of long-run dilemma, which I think nobody has really kind of thought about in India, because I think my broader point, and something I've made in my writings on India, is that we've always seen accountability from the expenditure side. We've never seen accountability from the taxation, especially direct taxation side. And that's, I think, something that needs to permeate much more of our political and fiscal discussions on India. And this is something we're going to raise in the next survey, by the way.
Excellent. Because, one of my hypotheses has been direct tax. This queue is continued primarily because we know that very few pay direct taxes, income taxes largely, and there's a capture. I mean, the loudest are the 3%. And which is why we have things like long-term capital gains exemption, tax exemptions. We have 6 income tax exemption threshold being raised 6 times over 20 years. It's this 3% that's making the loudest noises. And so perhaps, there is a strong capture here.
See, I think it's again a good question, but let me say what I think what is probably the way forward, right? I think that the problem or the challenge in India is, I think there's the capture issue. I think there's one set of issues, right? Which of course affects the capital gains issue and the wealth tax and all of that, right? But I think maybe the bigger question is what you started off with. Why don't, that 3 or 5 or 6%, whatever it is, why doesn't it become 30%? I think part of it has to do with the fact, and this is something that I think is one of the deepest insights on this, which Professor Indira Rajaraman made some time ago. I think there are 2 things going on here, right? People don't want to voluntarily pay taxes for 2 reasons, I think. One, I think they think if you don't have trust in government to spend well, to provide the basic essential services, then you're not going to voluntarily comply. I think the second, this is Indira Rajaraman's insight, which is that if you look at the history of taxation, the income tax comes later in the process, or at least the willingness to pay taxes, or let me take that back and say, redistribution comes later in the process, because you have to build sufficient trust that government can provide the basic public goods for everyone so that you feel you're benefiting something, and then you're willing to, for your taxes, the top 3% to go towards redistribution, right? But in India, the redistribution motive has come very early in terms of governmental responsibilities. I think this is part of what I would call the broader democracy tax in India, right? That if you become what I call the precocious development model, you become you have to redistribute early on in the process. You have to redistribute at a time when you don't have the state capacity to actually redistribute well. Right? So it creates a kind of vicious cycle, right? That you have to redistribute, but then if you redistribute early, you haven't provided public service, so the people are not willing to pay taxes.
Inefficient redistribution.
And you get inefficient redistribution. So I think that is, the bigger kind of political economy challenge for India going forward.
And that actually brings me to perhaps my last question about inequality. And Dr. Manmohan Singh, in a recent interview with me, when I asked him, what is the thing that worries you the most? And he said, really, it's inequality. And we talked about regional divergence. And one of the findings of my research is actually the breakpoint has been 1990. Actually, India, the large states, the 12 large states, which is what I used for my methodology, were converging up until then. From 65 to 90, they were converging, and you can see a clear break. Now, I am not implying anything here. I'm merely making an observation. And when he said inequality, and by inequality, he meant now individual inequality, income inequality.
Correct. And then the recent Piketty has done.
And Piketty and Chancel and all of this, right?
Yeah.
We talked about redistribution, how the state's been states thought about redistribution, but clearly it's not worked because inequality, if you believe Piketty, and I actually, despite his methodological issues, I actually think the broad point is right. So do you worry as much about inequality? And if you do, should we at all?
I think all of us should, certainly what I worry about the most which is both, so in diagnosis, it's slightly different from what you just said, but in prescription, I think it would actually address that. You see, I think that India's now really fundamental challenge, especially as you head into the uncertain world ahead, technology, all this, is that I think health and education for all, has to be now one of the biggest challenges, because I think that I call this India's founding original sin, that we've neglected health and I mean basic health and basic primary and secondary education. We could talk about higher education later, but that neglect, I think, both intrinsically, of course, there's a problem, because I think no society should have people who don't have the basics, but also it ill prepares you for the labor market of the future. The labor market of the future requires adaptability. It's not content, but flexibility, adaptability, the capacity to learn continually. And if you're not reasonably healthy and reasonably basically educated, I think you're going to be completely unprepared for that. So both for intrinsic and the instrumental demands of a new labor market going forward, I think this providing basic health and education to all must be, I think, everyone's worry. And the fact that we've neglected this historically must, I think, because once you do that, you also then, after all, what can you do to address inequality? Because remember on inequality can come about because market incomes are unequal, and then redistribution can make it less or more equal, right? Health and education is going to address the basic, market incomes being less unequal.
Sure.
And I think that's what I think we need to focus on, because in any case, post-tax, post-market income, we're not going to be terribly good at for a long time, because weak state capacity, inefficient redistribution. So I think just health and education is what will both address the inequality thing, prepare us for the future, intrinsically very important, and address the problem of market outcomes, as it were, how equal market outcomes can be.
So the state should not kind of burden itself in addressing income inequality as a policy goal, but address more.
Exactly.
Given democracy, the democracy tax that you talked about, is that viable? It's very hard for.
Yeah, I think they're both difficult. I think both are difficult. But I think that in this case, I just think we have to go on mission mode, kind of war mode, to kind of accomplish this. See, I think maybe this is a very important subject. I hope I'm not we're not carrying on too much about this.
No.
But I think that on health and education, let me tell you why I think you're right. It's a very difficult task, and I don't have a solution to this. Is that one of the amazing things, I think, about India over the last, 70, 80 years, independent India, is this neglect of health and education. Why has that not been politically costly? Why hasn't democratic politics thrown up opportunity in creating health? Because after all, remember, the numbers are huge. If politician can go and say, I have educated all the children in the state.
Or I provided hospitals,
Or hospitals, vote for me.
Absolutely.
Why doesn't that resonate? Why does it, I've built a road, resonate more? So, and I don't know the answer to that question. I have
a hunch.
I also have a hunch. We can compare hunches.
Okay, I think it's the first past the post electoral system. I think the math there just makes it so much easier to get past the post without having to do any of the hard work.
See, I don't know enough about electoral systems, so that could be one. My sense is that, and this is a slightly harsh verdict on Indian society as a whole, that if you look around the world, right, historical experiences, especially Myron Weiner has a great book on this, child in India and things. If you look around the world, I think universal primary education, universal health, I think the church had a lot to do with it in Western Europe, and I think it flows from a societal commitment to equality as an ethic. If you're a very hierarchical society like India is, and that ethic of equality is not etched in our DNA, and you can argue whether it's not. I mean, I think we'd all admit that hierarchy is kind of etched in our DNA.
It is, yeah.
Then I think that is probably what made this neglect of education and health perpetuate itself. And I think we have to re-examine this collectively.
So social values in sense. The notion of karma, for example,
exactly.
just accepting,
and hierarchy, the privileged, I mean, it's perpetuating privilege, right? If you deny access, that's a kind of slightly cynical interpretation, but I think there is something to the fact that the core ethic of equality that says that everyone should have the right to health and education and be healthy and educated. Forget about what, I mean, I think it gets reinforced given the market and the labor market of the future, but I think would be my
that's very interesting. That's actually been fascinating, but before I end, I want to ask you, so what can we look forward to in the next survey in terms of interesting analysis?
See, I think, this is always, the one thing I'll say is that India is so rich that, there's always going to be something interesting that can be done.
Yeah.
We hope we can do something. Let's see. We'll have to wait and see. But we always try to make it interesting in terms of analysis, but also accessibility. Everything.
Sure.
So new ideas, new data sets, everything. So we're going to try and do the best we can. But I must say that we are suffering from performance anxiety. To live up to the standards of the last few surveys.
And they've been exemplary the last few surveys. So thank you, Arvind. This discussion has always been fascinating. You've made me think quite a bit about my established notions of GST and divergence and inequality, but thank you, and I hope viewers did too. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Praveen. Yeah.